I'm Dr. Judy Melinek. I'm a board-certified forensic pathologist, and I just watched the Nolan Wells press conference, and I wanted to share some context for everyone. Being able to definitively state the cause of death after a body has not been found for several days and has been subsequently autopsied twice with signs of decomposition is incredibly unlikely. Drowning is what's called a diagnosis of exclusion, which means that when you've got a fresh body, you want to be able to look at the body and see if there's any other causes of death for that body that is found in water that exclude the death being exclusively a drowning. So for example, if someone is shot and then thrown in the water, you'll have that gunshot and they'll be bleeding and the gunshot will be the cause of death, and the thrown in the water is not the cause of death. It's not even on the death certificate. If a person is strangled and they die from strangulation and then their dead body is thrown in the water, their body will take on water, but the cause of death is going to be strangulation, not drowning. Also for any kind of traumatic injuries. Now we got to talk about natural death for a second. If someone has a heart attack while they are swimming, and because they're having the heart attack as they are exercising in the water and they take on water and they drown, the cause of death is actually drowning, and the heart attack is listed on the death certificate under other significant conditions contributing to death. So even though the heart attack might have killed them on dry land, it might not have. Most certainly they wouldn't have drowned on dry land. So we defer to the hostile environment, which is the water, to call it a drowning. Now, identifying natural disease and identifying trauma is relatively easy in a fresh body. It can be very difficult in a decomposed body. His body was found 2 days after he disappeared, and this second autopsy done by Dr. Roger Mitchell wasn't until 4 days later. So we're dealing with quite a bit of decomposition, even if the body was refrigerated during that time. And then we have this other issue of the fact that not all the results are back. The toxicology would have been done on the fluids from the body from the first autopsy. From the second autopsy, you're going to have a lot higher alcohol levels from the decomposition caused by bacteria, not caused by drinking. So again, it's the fluid and blood from the first autopsy that really matter. And the other thing you have to consider, and there's one other important piece of information from that press conference, which is that the neck block, the portion of the neck from the front end, was missing. So Dr. Mitchell did not have a chance to examine that part of Nolan Wells' anatomy. Why is that important? Because if somebody is strangled, especially manual strangulation, the injuries are going to be to the front of the neck. There may be some redness at the back of the neck as well if, injury comes from behind, but generally this part of the neck doesn't have the major blood vessels and the airway. It's the front of the neck that does. So compression or damage to the front of the airway, that's going to be found in the neck block that is still sitting at the medical examiner's office that was not released with the body. So you may ask, is this common practice for pathologists to keep a portion of the anatomy with them at the medical examiner's office and not release it to the family? And the answer is yes. We will sometimes retain important specimens that have pathology in a jar under formaldehyde at the medical examiner's office for further examination or as evidence. And the absence of that neck block is really important because we still don't have information from the first autopsy that has not been released yet. So we don't know if it was kept out of an abundance of caution, meaning that it didn't have any findings and it was negative, or it was kept because it has findings, because there's a broken hyoid bone, or because there's hemorrhage in the strap muscles. Until we get that first autopsy report, we don't know why it's been retained. So why should anybody do a second autopsy? A second autopsy is often done in cases where there is a high-profile case such as this, or there is concern from the family for foul play, and they're just not getting answers from the medical examiner's office because the medical examiner's office is still doing their investigation and is keeping things under wraps, because if there is foul play, they have the evidence, they have the physical evidence that might be able to trap the killer, and they don't want to release that to the public. Even if there is no evidence of foul play, just the lack of evidence is evidence and is important information that might affect how people are interrogated, whether they're going to tell the truth or not the truth about what happened to him. You have to understand that the medical examiner's autopsy is legally mandated, and it is ultimately the most independent autopsy because it's not beholden to the family, it's not beholden to the prosecutor, to the police, to anybody else. It's an independent agency. So that is an independent autopsy, but it takes time. And it takes time until we get all the information back, including the toxicology report. And to answer the question, if somebody's intoxicated and they drown as a result of their intoxication, meaning that they're just, too intoxicated to be able to swim adequately, the cause of death would still be a drowning, but the intoxication would be considered a significant contributing condition. But because of what I said about alcohol forming from bacteria after death, if the body is decomposed, you have to subtract some of that alcohol because it may have been caused by bacteria and may not have been a sign of intoxication. And you can have up to 0.20 gram percent. So 0.08 is above the legal limit in most states for driving, but you can get up to 0.20 in a massively decomposed body. So it really throws you off when you have decomposition and alcohol to try to figure out whether there was alcohol on board or whether all of it's just been made by bacteria. So I hope this answers some questions about what I saw in the press conference, what other people saw as well. I will go through the autopsy, or at least the report that's been released, with a fine-tooth comb, but these are just my first impressions based on watching the press report.
Why do we believe something just because it's said with confidence? Why does our mind stop questioning the second someone in authority speaks with certainty? And what happens when the single piece of evidence that could actually answer everything is kept locked away where hardly anyone can access it? That's precisely what's unfolding right now in the Nolan Wells case. Investigators, reporters, and now a forensic physician are re-examining everything with fresh eyes, and what they're seeing doesn't match what we were told months ago. A medical professional reviewing the accessible materials has raised something crucial: the potential for manual strangulation. That one statement has reopened everything. So what led this trained forensic specialist to challenge the official narrative? What exactly were they able to review? And perhaps more critically, what were they prevented from examining? These aren't trivial questions. They challenge the entire basis of what the public was instructed to accept. To better understand the autopsy findings, let's look at a follow-up interview with Dr. Judy Melinek. When asked about the autopsy report, she offered the following analysis.
Tonight, we're breaking down the preliminary findings of that second autopsy. I spoke with Dr. Judy Melinek, a board-certified pathologist who is not affiliated with this case, about the report. So in cases where a body is found in or around water, what do forensic pathologists tend to look out for when conducting an autopsy?
When a body's in water, it's not always clear whether they died as a result of being in the water, meaning that they drowned, or they died of something else and they were just disposed of in the water. So if there is traumatic injury to the body, like a stab wound or a gunshot wound or a strangulation, that would kill the person, generally we will defer to that as the cause of death. We will say the cause of death is the trauma and being in the water is irrelevant. Versus if we find, for example, a natural disease process like a heart attack, then if a person had a heart attack while they were swimming, we would still call that a drowning, but we would acknowledge the heart disease as a significant contributing condition. And the same thing would apply for something like drugs or alcohol that incapacitate you and cause you to drown. The cause of death would be drowning, but we would put the drugs or the alcohol as a significant contributing condition.
In the preliminary discussion of the report, the forensic pathologist mentioned several limitations he encountered, one being the absence of several neck structures. For most people, that kind of sounds odd that the body was sent without those parts, but as the report states, that's actually a common forensic pathology practice. Can you explain why those structures might have been kept during the initial autopsy?
So the neck structures would be where you would see any evidence of injury to the neck or potentially strangulation injury. Retaining those structures does not necessarily mean that they have trauma there. They may have been retained out of an abundance of caution, but they may have also shown some sort of injury or disease process like obstruction that necessitated their being kept by the medical examiner because it's evidence. So retaining tissue or organs in a high profile or suspicious case is common practice for a medical examiner and is not sign of any kind of conspiracy or cover up. That is exactly what the medical examiner is supposed to do when they have a case where they either find trauma or they don't find trauma, but they want to keep it because of the circumstances and the suspicions that have been raised.
The thing about the second autopsy that really stood out to me was that 12 by 8 inch focal area of red discoloration in the deep soft tissues on the back of his head. And there were no lacerations of the overlying skin or fractures on the skull, according to the report. But can you discuss what could have caused that discoloration?
The second postmortem exam was done on a body that had been several days from being found. So we're dealing with, I believe, 2 days between when Nolan Wells was first missing and when his body was found and then autopsied, and another 4 days that have passed until the second postmortem exam. So the body is decomposed. It falls apart after death, and discoloration could be a sign of injury, like bleeding, or it could also be a sign of some sort of pressure being applied, potentially during the first autopsy itself. So this particular location on the back of the head is a common area where we place a block during the first autopsy, and that may have been the source of the discoloration, and it may have absolutely nothing to do with trauma. The only way to know is to get pieces of tissue under the microscope, and that is something that Dr. Mitchell, the pathologist who did the second autopsy, is going to be doing to look to see if that discoloration is bleeding or hemorrhage.
Why might the initial autopsy not have included a dissection of the back of the head where that discoloration was found, like the second autopsy did?
In part, a first autopsy pathologist might not autopsy that area or dissect that area because they don't see anything on the surface of the skin when the body is fresher. So they don't suspect that there's any trauma there. And they may have other parts of the body that have significant findings that they're focusing their attention on. So it's not unusual for a second autopsy pathologist who's given a body that is starting to decompose to work harder to look at areas that the first pathologist may not have looked at because they hadn't suspected injury there, since when the body was fresh, they didn't see any external signs of injury.
And we're all, of course, still waiting on that toxicology report from the initial autopsy. Yeah. Now, based on these preliminary findings that were laid out in this report and the questions that, still remain about the circumstances surrounding Wells's death, could this case really come down to that toxicology report?
I doubt it. It's not a single report that answers any question. It can gives you a piece of the puzzle, but you really need the scene and the circumstances. What is going to make or break this case is going to be the police investigation, finding out exactly how he got into the water, whether he was alone or whether there were other people with him at the time. That's going to make the difference in terms of determining whether it was an accident, as in an accidental drowning, or potentially a homicide.
If this is hitting different for you, take a second to smash that like button, subscribe so you catch what's coming, and leave a comment telling me where you're tuning in from. Seriously, it makes a bigger difference than you realize. In the next several minutes, we're diving into the medical evidence, the forensic reasoning, and the specifics that almost never make it into mainstream coverage. By the time we're finished, you'll see exactly why this physician's conclusion has sparked one of the most significant discussions in this entire investigation, and why the actual answer might be hidden somewhere nobody's been granted access to. Evidence in this case is trickling out gradually, bit by bit. And honestly, the outlets racing to break news first are typically the ones getting the facts twisted. We'd rather deliver accuracy than speed. That only matters if you're here when the next revelation surfaces. Let's establish what the proper procedure should look like, because recognizing what failed requires understanding what's supposed to happen. A determination of death cause isn't something you estimate while standing at a recovery site. It's something you conclude only after systematically testing and eliminating every alternative explanation. In this instance, that sequence got reversed before any official examination even commenced. Within days of Nolan going missing, the sheriff leading Jackson County stood before media and announced there was no foul play involved. At that precise moment, no autopsy had been conducted. No pathologist had assessed the body. The investigation was, by every standard, still in its opening stages. Yet the public received a definitive answer as if the matter was already resolved. Here's what most viewers don't understand about forensic pathology involving bodies retrieved from water. Drowning is classified as a diagnosis of exclusion. That means an examiner cannot simply observe a body recovered from a lake and record drowning as the cause. Water conceals nearly everything. A person can drown, or they can die from an entirely different cause and subsequently end up in water. Visually, both scenarios can appear almost identical. Therefore, the examiner must work in reverse, eliminating head trauma, cervical injury, toxic substances, internal hemorrhaging, everything first. Only after every alternative explanation has been systematically ruled out can drowning be documented as the determination. That's established protocol. It's not discretionary. The sheriff's media statement bypassed that complete process. He provided the conclusion before anyone had examined the evidence. Now consider the timeline, because it carries more significance than most realize. Nolan was a young person who'd been missing for multiple days before his body was discovered in water on July 6th. Each one of those days alters what a body can communicate to an examiner. Decomposition doesn't pause while investigators work. Submersion modifies tissue. Time eliminates details. From the moment Nolan was found, every subsequent hour diminished the precision of whatever analysis would follow. Which makes it even more troubling that the public declaration came so rapidly and so definitively, exactly when maximum caution should have been exercised. In fairness, perhaps the sheriff observed something at the recovery location that influenced his announcement. But a scene observation isn't a documented, scientifically validated finding. It's not something an external specialist can assess. A statement delivered on camera holds massive influence with the public, regardless of whether it's scientifically substantiated yet. Once authorities declare accident, that characterization follows the case universally. It determines how vigorously evidence gets collected, how the public interprets emerging information, and how much momentum exists to investigate further. You investigate first, you declare second. Here, that sequence was inverted, and once inverted, it's extraordinarily challenging to correct. Nolan's family didn't quietly accept that, but they also didn't respond with televised anger. They responded by securing their own independent pathologist and engaging attorney Ben Crump, a name recognizable to anyone following cases where families suspect the official account isn't the complete truth. An independent autopsy was executed on July 10th, mere days after Nolan's body was found, providing a separate examiner the opportunity to verify the state's conclusion against the actual physical evidence. But a second autopsy is never a fresh beginning. By the time it occurs, time has already inflicted damage, and in forensic science, time eliminates information rather than protecting it. A body functions as a type of physical documentation, but it's documentation that deteriorates with every hour that passes. In this instance, the body had already remained in water for days before discovery, then underwent the state's preliminary autopsy, and only following all of that did the independent examiner receive their opportunity. Refrigeration decelerates decomposition. It doesn't halt it. Water only compounds the challenge further, breaking down tissue and obscuring details an examiner relies upon. The second pathologist was essentially analyzing a record that had already suffered environmental degradation. The outcome of that independent examination wasn't accident. It wasn't homicide either. It was something more technically precise, undetermined. That designation gets consistently misinterpreted, so let's be specific about what it genuinely signifies. Undetermined doesn't indicate nothing occurred. It doesn't suggest the family's questions are without merit. It indicates the accessible evidence wasn't adequate to definitively establish any singular explanation. One side provided a rapid, certain answer. The other side, examining far more methodically, acknowledged they couldn't reach certainty at all. That isn't two professionals disagreeing about interpretation. That's a specialist refusing to claim more than the evidence genuinely supports. So why couldn't the independent examiner achieve a more definitive determination? They possessed the expertise. They had the family's complete cooperation. They had the body before them. What they lacked was comprehensive access. Because an autopsy can only analyze what's physically available, and in this situation, something critical was absent from their examination table. Not lost to decomposition, not eliminated by water, simply retained. That absent section was the anterior neck, specifically the internal components forensic examiners reference as the neck block. It had been kept by the state medical examiner's facility and never provided along with the remainder of the body. When the independent pathologist performed their examination, that complete region simply wasn't accessible to them. Here's why that specification matters far more than it might sound. Different death causes produce evidence in different anatomical locations, and when the consideration involves manual strangulation, the evidence concentrates almost exclusively in the front of the neck, not the posterior. The back is predominantly muscle and vertebrae. The front is where the trachea resides, where the principal blood vessels course, and where the physical indicators of compression would manifest if they exist whatsoever. There are three particular things a forensic examiner searches for in situations like this. First, the hyoid bone, a diminutive, fragile, U-shaped bone positioned high in the anterior throat. Unlike most skeletal structures in the body, it's relatively exposed, and in certain manual strangulation incidents, it can break under force. Second, the infrahyoid muscles, the slender muscles descending along the front of the neck, where microscopic blood vessels can burst internally under constriction, producing indicators a qualified eye can identify even when nothing is apparent on the exterior. Third, petechiae, the minute hemorrhages that manifest when small vessels rupture from continuous pressure, frequently discovered in the eyes, the facial tissue, or the cardiac lining. Combined, these three indicators create an identifiable pattern, and pattern identification is the cornerstone of forensic pathology. All three of those indicators exist in the precise region that was kept and never released, which leads us to the physician's recent declaration. A pathologist evaluating the obtainable materials could only identify the clear constraint. Without the anterior neck, you cannot verify strangulation, but you similarly cannot eliminate it. That's the dilemma at the center of this case. It isn't that the evidence establishes anything, it's that the evidence capable of resolving the question was never provided to the individuals attempting to resolve it independently. Now, to be balanced, retaining tissue during an investigation isn't inherently questionable. Medical examiners execute this routinely, sometimes to preserve material for additional analysis, sometimes to secure it as evidence. By itself, retention demonstrates nothing improper, but here's why it remains significant. If the state retained that tissue, the state analyzed that tissue. And whatever they discovered from it exists somewhere in the initial autopsy documentation, a document the public still hasn't accessed. The retention itself isn't the controversy, the secrecy surrounding it is. There's a secondary complication in this case that appears straightforward on paper and isn't: the toxicology. A figure on a laboratory report appears objective, but one specific measurement can be profoundly deceptive without anyone being dishonest about it. Blood alcohol concentration. In a recent case, a blood alcohol measurement typically represents exactly what it suggests. But this wasn't a recent case, and that transforms the calculation completely. Following death, as a body initiates decomposition, bacteria become operative, and those bacteria can generate alcohol independently, completely separate from anything the individual actually ingested. In bodies that have experienced substantial decomposition, this endogenously produced alcohol can escalate sufficiently to exceed a legal standard based exclusively on bacterial metabolism, not conduct. Considering that Nolan's body remained in water for days before discovery, any toxicology measurement associated with alcohol requires interpretation with that decomposition incorporated, not accepted at nominal value. A meticulous examiner considers the extent of decay, verifies corroborating chemical indicators, and calibrates appropriately. Anyone interpreting a raw figure as confirmation of intoxication without that framework is operating with an insufficient picture. There's also a procedural dimension to this story distinct from the forensic specifics. At one juncture, a journalist appeared personally, demanding direct responses instead of depending on indirect communications. The demeanor had observably transformed. Initial confidence had been substituted with a considerably more ambiguous statement. The case continued under active investigation. Observe the inconsistency contained in that. You cannot concurrently characterize something as a resolved accident and portray it as actively under investigation. If it's still being investigated, it was never as finalized as it originally appeared. When challenged for particulars, authorities provided minimal beyond evasion, redirecting toward other agencies rather than responding directly. This is where wider questions began developing among the public, not allegations, simply justified concerns. In a compact county, authorities regularly know one another and function within the identical interconnected system. That alone isn't misconduct, but it does present a reasonable question about how assured the public can be that an investigation remained completely independent when the individuals executing it are personally affiliated. That question is exactly why independent verification exists initially, and why the family pursued a second evaluation at all. So here's the current situation. A problematic toxicology measurement that demands context to interpret accurately. An official declaration that moderated substantially under direct challenge. A family requesting only for openness, not accusation. And a public questioning whether the investigation process itself can be relied upon from within. Two distinctly different issues. One grounded in science, and one grounded in procedure. But they both return to the identical absent record, the initial autopsy documentation, which nobody outside the state has viewed. There's a substantial difference between a case being unsolvable and a case being incomplete. Unsolvable suggests the answers are permanently gone. This case is incomplete because the answers still remain. They simply haven't been disclosed yet. Three particular actions would advance this case forward. First, the original autopsy documentation itself, the state's recorded findings that could clarify the body's condition and validate why specific tissue was retained initially. Second, the retained cervical tissue, which hasn't been destroyed, merely withheld, indicating an independent, credentialed examiner could still analyze it directly if provided complete access. Third, a comprehensive and appropriately interpreted toxicology analysis, one that incorporates decomposition rather than displaying a raw measurement devoid of framework. None of these demand conjecture. They demand disclosure and availability. Nothing beyond that. To be entirely balanced, no offense has been established here. Nobody has been prosecuted. The independent determination remains undetermined, and nothing in this presentation asserts otherwise. What's uncontested is that a determination was announced publicly before the analysis was even finalized. And that singular action is what initiated this complete discussion. The family isn't insisting on a suspect or a prosecution. They're requesting something that should be considerably simpler to supply. Recorded, disclosed, confirmable truth. Disclose the documentation. Provide access to the retained tissue. Complete the toxicology appropriately. Whatever the evidence demonstrates, whether it indicates an accident or something altogether different, the family merits a resolution they can genuinely trust. We don't possess the resolution of this story yet, but we know exactly what it will require to reach there. And when those records emerge, we'll be here analyzing them transparently, without distortion, and without delaying for someone else to interpret it initially. If you want to be present for that development instead of discovering it indirectly afterward, subscribe immediately and activate notifications, because a case like this doesn't remain dormant for extended periods, and the following update could arrive at any moment.